When we first visited Inchenhausen, we were very curious about it because actually it existed at the end of a suburban street, which is just full of, high-rise flats. And at the end there was a walled area, and behind the walled area there was the motel, and then there was the phone tapping services, and then there was another walled area which contained the prison. So for anybody else living here on this street, I think people were totally unaware that this actually was a prison at the end of their street. And obviously for likewise the prisoners who were brought here, they had no conception of where they were being taken to. They didn't even know they were still in Berlin when they were brought here. So it seemed to take on very abstract, sinister, very secretive overtones. Came to have a look around. We were shown the torture chambers that had been built by the Russians when it had been an internment camp for Nazi sympathisers. And Jane and I sort of felt, well, that really sort of wasn't the area that we wanted to kind of look at, because in a way it seemed almost too emotionally loaded. When we came here, we were feeling we didn't really want to make a documentary. We didn't want it to be a documentary, because we don't make documentaries. We're essentially artists who like to do film, So it was interesting to come around here and see this, and then think how it would be at all possible to record it. And I think, having looked at it, we really felt that the most we could ever intervene would be to use lighting and to maybe use a figure, and that would be the most dramatic intervention.
As that hand lifts higher toward your face, you feel very comfortable, very relaxed.
In the last 10 years or so, Jane and Louise seem to have turned away from their twinness, as it were. They've radically differentiated their appearances. Until quite recently, they looked almost identical, and their work too has moved away from the personal towards a kind of political abstraction.
And when it touches your face, you can enter a deep, hypnotic trance.
Altered states of consciousness were a big theme in Jane and Louise's early work. In their later works, with their hypnotic investigations of politically charged sites, it's almost as though they're attempting to alter the consciousness of the viewer.
When we first came back to England, we were looking at decommissioned spaces or recently abandoned spaces. We got a list through the MOD of various military bases and various military decommissioned sites. And looking at them, Greenham Common was the one that, for us, was a very instant, iconic thing that we wanted to go and visit.
At Greenham Common today, Tomahawk cruise missiles and possibly warheads arrived in substantial numbers.
0216, continue to the end, left turn at the end.
As the first transporter touched down, scores of waiting paratroopers rushed forward.
Greenham Common was an American military base which housed nuclear weapons. It was also the site of a prolonged peace protest associated with the feminist movement in the 80s. Jane and Louise made their film Gamma there after the base had been abandoned.
growing up during the 80s and being part of the CND and also being in part of that era, the threat of a nuclear attack seemed very prescient. It was just something about these leftovers from that period that we were very keen to film, and also to look at specifically the area which was still not decommissioned. This was the area called Gamma, and it was the area where they had the Hangar 303 and the silos. Yeah, so this was an actual existing site there that said two-man policy, no lone zone, and it was part of the security that they had there, and the silo, which was obviously, it couldn't be manned by one man, it had to be manned by two people, and it meant that there was two codes that would need to be used to actually send a nuclear missile off. So basically the two people for security thing didn't know what the other person's code was, so they couldn't actually do it independently, they'd have to do it together. It seemed oddly resonant, this kind of language, two-man policy, no lone zone, especially in light of us and our collaborative activity. We also showed some photographic works that were again about 2 meters by 2 meters, and a lot of those stills were sort of done pre-filming. If you see this mural here, which is like dog flight, which is painted by this with a griffin and a bulldog, and sort of realise actually that these American soldiers had this intense emotional response. Also, and even inside, there was this kind of real sort of macho drive to sort of
absolutely. But the space is not designed for human beings. I mean, you've got a load of young American soldiers there having to live there, and being contained there, possibly not believing in what they're doing at all either. I mean, it's a totally non-human space. It was quite inspiring to see these women actually having a go at changing things.
But they were always seen as militant tykes, really. That's how they were always presented.
Well, so is every woman in the media, As soon as you stand up, you're a angry dyke. We're used to that.
But it's funny because it was like Louise was saying, it was all of that hysteria was always reported from what was on the outside of the perimeter, but actually it was interesting getting inside, because you could see there was also some very much male hysteria going on inside from the soldiers. So the figure in this one is wearing an American military uniform that would have been worn in the mid-80s by American servicewomen who would have been working there on the base. You just catch a glimpse of someone operating the controls there, and then the camera passes down and goes straight down into the command centre. I mean, I think we're thinking that we just wanted to show how this building would have been when it was functioning in some ways, or how it would have functioned had there been people in there. And if there was narrative, that was about the depth of it, really.
In the early days of their career, Jane and Louise's work seemed to be exploring issues of sibling rivalry. There's an image of one hanging while the other drowns. The expression on their faces is blank, but the underlying suggestion is murderous.
I would say something like Garage, that absolutely came out of being in separate art colleges, and not even at that point being fully aware of the fact that we were collaborating together, but it was sort of the first image that we made. It was just using each other as props in these images that we were creating. If you were to think about it as being about sibling rivalry, on one level it's about those kind of questions, but it's also about being women, being artists, working together. You were only ever seen as one particular identity in each art college. So, for example, the tutors there weren't necessarily aware that I had a twin.
The twins moved from Newcastle to London in 1990 to do a joint MA at Goldsmiths, by then a recognised hotbed of talent, with the emergence of a new generation of British artists who would later be known as the YBAs.
Yeah, well,
we'd applied to Goldsmiths in 1989, and we'd made a joint application because we'd already been making work together when we were on undergraduate. So they accepted us for a joint MA, and we started it in 1990, and that's when we moved down to London. I think we came with a sleeping bag and a tin of baked beans or something. I can't remember, something really. It was kind of strange. It was almost like you got off the train from Newcastle, arrived in King's Cross and never went any further, really. Very transient, and also quite a red light area as well. Especially when we were down here. I mean, there's still quite a lot of drugs and prostitution around here, but I mean, in the early 90s, it hadn't really had the facelift that it's getting now. So it was so interesting to be in an area that was bang in the centre of London, and yet it kind of was so, dispossessed, really. It was good. I think it contributed in a sense that we were very aware of the kind of underlying menace or something that could, be actually quite sinister about a place. And I think that was sort of heightened by the fact that we had the door smashed in when we first moved in, within the first 2 weeks of living there. I think we're thinking there's a lot of foreboding. Not only just coming straight from here, from living in the north, but also coming down to live in King's Cross, but also feeling, there was a sense of criminal activity in this area, which, you couldn't escape really, whether it was the drugs or whether it was prostitution or whether it was, other stuff. I mean, when we lived here, they arrested. Sorry, I was going to say. But when we lived here, they arrested the director of public prosecutions for curb crawling. I think it was a very good period for us creatively, because it was that shift from not being in college but being independent and having your own studio, which, as it transpired, was 66A really, and using that as that as a base to make work. We also spent a week in a bed and breakfast, just around the corner in one of those squares, and started to shoot things in different situations, not just in your domestic space, but kind of moving into, a bed and breakfast, which is very specific to that period of London at that time, because, it was quite a difficult time economically, and a lot of people had been kind of forced to, leave their homes because they couldn't afford the mortgages, and then they were housed temporarily in bed and breakfast.
Jane and Louise's work in the 90s evolved into playful investigations of the visual language of horror films, music video and advertising. Their first work on film was Normopaths from 1995.
That early work, Normopath, was incredibly unexpected, because on the one hand, there were these very dynamic figures in these rather glamorous costumes, sort of catapulting through the air. But I think more than anything else, it's this extraordinary ability they have to convey a sense of space and let their filming of the space tell you everything that they want you to take, how they want you to read it. And that, as a form of communication, is fantastically powerful.
I think it's very hard to kind of objectify what you're doing when you're filming and when you're making a work that you are, because there's a dialogue that goes on with us.
I think that's it.
That it's just, it's part of what we enjoy and part of what we kind of still like about each other's kind of discussions, and whether we agree or disagree, and frequently disagree, but also manage to always agree on something that needs to be done.
Working banter that goes on, that obviously is part of a collaboration.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the relationship
relationship is that there's obviously quite, you know.
But I think there's a way that people just kind of always evolve. Yeah, exactly. People always just see it in terms of a unit term, and is this unit, and this unit with this voice, with this kind of approach. And it's like, you know, we're not just a unit. Clearly, we're not just a unit, but we are, you know, we do have a good dialogue together, and that's very much part of what our creative process involves.
you